Hey everyone, welcome to Unit 2 on what sociologists do. In this unit we're going to be looking at something called research methods. So we know that sociologists use scientific research, but this is looking at how they actually go about the process of doing that research. So let's look at what you're going to learn in this video. You should now be reading along in Chapter 2 of your textbook, and the section on research methods is pages 31 to 36. So in this unit, you're going to look at some of the steps for conducting research, and you're also going to look at the differences between qualitative and quantitative data collection methods, and you're going to examine some issues in data collection and analysis. Some of the important points about doing sociological research include the fact that it challenges overgeneralization and exposes myths. It helps to explain people's behavior. It influences social policies, and it sharpens critical thinking skills that affect our daily lives. So we're going to spend the next 10 minutes or so looking at the 7 steps in the research cycle. These are found on pages 31 to 32 of your textbook. The first step is choosing a research idea. So find something that you're interested in. You choose a topic based on personal interest, or maybe because there's a pressing social problem in your community, and then you define the problem that you're going to study. Step 2 is called a literature review, and this involves reviewing previous scholarly research about the problem and to pinpoint an area for study. The third step involves formulating hypotheses. This is proposing a relationship between variables and testing it. Variables are defined as traits that change over time. So let's look at this step 3 of the research process, formulating a hypothesis. And you'll study a little bit more about this in your Introduction to Psychology course as well, because social science uses many of the same research methods. So let's look at the difference between 2 variables. There are more than 2 types of variables, but for our purposes here, we're going to start with just independent and dependent variables. Okay. On the right-hand side, let's begin with the independent variable. The independent variable is the variable that we think will change or influence the dependent variable. So all you have to simply remember is independent is going to have an effect on the dependent variable. So the dependent variable is the variable that we're trying to predict and we're trying to explain. It is the outcome that is affected by the independent variable. So let's see if you can identify the independent and dependent variables in this hypothesis. So let's say, for example, that there was a lot of vandalism happening in your neighborhood, and people thought that young people were involved in the vandalism. And so one of the hypotheses was that perhaps as a solution, a curfew could be imposed, and that a curfew would help to reduce vandalism rates. But you wanted to study this hypothesis first to see if there was any evidence out there to prove that curfews were actually effective in doing this. So I want you to take a few minutes and think about that hypothesis. Based on that hypothesis, what would you identify as the dependent variable? That's the variable that we're trying to predict and we're trying to explain. And then identify what is the independent variable. What is the variable that we think will change or influence the dependent variable? Let's see if you were right. The dependent variable, the one that we're trying to predict and explain, are vandalism rates. The independent variable in this hypothesis is curfews. We think curfews will change or influence the dependent variable of vandalism rates. So let's now look at step 4 in the 7-step research cycle, research design. So you may use qualitative, quantitative, or a mixed methods approach, which is a mix of qualitative and quantitative, to gather data. It means to gather information. Quantitative research approaches focus on numerical data. They generally use larger samples, and they're good for looking at trends over a long period of time, something that's called longitudinal study. Qualitative research methods focus on non-numerical forms of data or information. Generally, they use smaller samples, and the focus is to arrive at some individual's understanding of a particular experience. Many researchers will use a mix of both of these methods in their study. Now let's look at step 5 in the 7-step research cycle, data collection. Data collection methods include surveys, field research, experiments, content analysis, and secondary analysis of existing data. So let's take a few minutes and look at what all of these mean. Here are some of the major data collection methods. Unobtrusive methods are methods where researchers do not intrude in the research context. It includes non-participant observation and content analysis. Participant observation as a data collection method gathers information by actually participating in the social group that's being studied. Surveys usually involve a researcher who's designed a questionnaire to use in their survey. A questionnaire has a set of questions with a choice of predetermined answers designed for the purpose of the survey. The next data collection method is interviews. This is where respondents are asked questions by the researcher through face-to-face encounter or over the phone. The questions can be structured or they can be open-ended. The next method is called secondary data collection, and that's where you use data gathered by another researcher or by government sources. And last but not least is experiments. That's a method to study a possible cause and effect relationship under well-controlled and regulated laboratory conditions. This is rarely used by sociologists because it is artificial, and so we're not going to explore that particular data collection method here. Let's look at each of these one by one. Unobtrusive methods. That's where the researcher studies phenomena without actually being part of the research context. It also involves content analysis, which is the analysis of content from public communication, can be oral or written, and includes things like books, diaries, websites, speeches, popular songs, and so on. Non-participant observation is direct observation, but it does not involve interacting with participants. If you want to practice doing this, there's an exercise on page 37 of your textbook. With content analysis, researchers examine a form of communication. Then they develop their categories, they code the material, and coding is used to sort and analyze data. And finally, the researchers draw a conclusion about the results. With participant observation, the role of the researcher is to act both as a participant and an observer in the research process. This can be really useful because researchers can gain first-hand insight into the activities and attitudes of the group members. It's often very effective in studying closed groups. Some of the risks associated with participant observation is related to the double role that the researcher plays. So they may identify with the group too closely and lose their objectivity, or the researcher may change the process they observe and participate in by their mere presence. There's a really interesting example of a PhD student by the name of Daniel Wolf. Daniel was a biker. He was really interested in doing his doctoral dissertation on biking and bikers, and he decided that he would get approval to actually covertly join the Rebels motorcycle group. And he rode with them covertly for almost a year. And at one point during his participation with this group, he decided to reveal the fact that he was a researcher and that he would like to publish some of his findings from the group. Not the stereotypes that people have about bikers, but actually the structure of the group, different values attached to the group. And so he wrote this book called The Rebels, a brotherhood of outlaw bikers. Very interesting book. If you're ever interested in reading more about it, I'd highly recommend it. The next data collection method that I want to briefly talk about is surveys. So with surveys, the role of the researcher is to administer the survey. They can reach out to a lot of people in a relatively short period of time. The researcher must first determine the population of interest. So the population is the set of all the people who share the characteristic of interest to the researcher. And then from that population, since it's too costly and time-consuming to gather information from every single member of that population, the researcher uses a sample to collect data. And the questionnaire provides a set of questions to respondents. It's either administered through mail or online. Respondents record their own answers. It's very simple and inexpensive to administer as a data collection method, but there is a very low response rate on people actually filling them out and returning them. So let's delve a little bit deeper into the concept we just talked about called populations and samples. And sometimes you'll see them in mathematical equations. And a capital N is the numerical sign used to represent population, and a small n is used to represent samples. So we look at a target population, the defined group of people about whom the researcher wants to get information. Really costly and time-consuming to try and study every single member of the target population. So what we do instead is we take a small part of that population from the larger group in order to learn and make inference back to the entire population. So a large sample usually is more than 250, a small sample usually less than 30, but you usually need a minimum of 30 in order to be statistically reliable. Two types of sampling procedures, probability types and non-probability types. So let's take a look first at something called random samples. So random sample, the process involves narrowing down a population by taking a complete list of all the members, choosing a random starting point, and then selecting a sample of people at a set interval. So for example, every fifth person on a list. So say for example, my population that I wanted to study were all the students at Niagara College. So what I would do is I would take a complete list of all the students at the college. I would choose a random starting point on that list, and then I would go down the list, and every fifth person on that list would be chosen to participate in the study. Probability means that every member of the population has an equal chance of being selected for the sample due to random selection. So in this example, every student at Niagara College would have a chance of being selected. It is considered the most accurate sampling procedure. A convenience sample is considered a non-probability sample. So basically it means that not every member of your population has a chance of being selected. What happens with a convenience sample is you narrow down a population by choosing a sample of people based on simply who's convenient. So when you see somebody standing in a mall with a clipboard and you happen to be walking by and they ask you if you'll complete a survey, that's an example of a convenience sample. Another example is maybe your professor is studying exercise behavior among college students. So they hand out a survey to all the students in the Introduction to Sociology class because this is convenient. It's less accurate with non-probability sampling methods, unfortunately, and it's not necessarily representative of a cross-section of all college students. Another example of a non-probability sampling procedure is something called a snowball sample. That's where you narrow down a population by starting with one respondent and then asking that person to recommend someone else. So you're talking to a student and you say, hey, do you know anybody else who might be interested in answering questions to this survey? And it rolls on, and then your sample size begins to grow. Just like as if you were rolling a snowball, and the more you roll it, the larger it gets. Questionnaires generally use something called a Likert scale. So questionnaires usually have next to the questions a 5-point or a 7-point scale. So you read the question, and then you can check off a box that most strongly aligns with your response. A 5-point Likert scale might use something like strongly positive to strongly negative, or strongly agree to strongly disagree. Let's now look at interviews as a data collection method. The role of interviewers is to ask people being interviewed, called respondents, questions. And they do that face-to-face, or they do that over the phone, and you record the answers. An interview can collect qualitative or quantitative data, and it can be structured or unstructured. And the interviewer usually records these answers, usually with a tape recorder, and transcribes those. Structured interviews is where each respondent is asked a standard set of questions in the same order and the same questions. Unstructured interviews are questions that are open-ended, and the person answering the questions can answer freely, and the interviewer also has the option to change the order of the questions, or sometimes they can ask more probing questions based on the respondent's answers. Let's look at a comparison between these three options. Some of the pros of a questionnaire is that they're simple and cost-effective to administer, but a big con is that you have a low response rate. One of the pros of personal interviews is that you can probe respondents when you're face-to-face in unstructured interviews for further detail, and you can get really rich data as a result of that. You can also clarify the meaning of questions and answer respondents' questions in structured interviews. One of the cons, though, with personal interviews is that there's a major cost to administer these. The telephone interviews are good for random sampling because oftentimes you can use digitized random selection of phone numbers. But a couple of major cons to using telephone interviews is that you miss people who don't have phones, and the fact that telemarketing has contributed to low response rates. Secondary data analysis as a data collection method uses researchers to analyze and interpret data that's collected and gathered from other researchers or the government. A meta-analysis, for example, interprets data that's been gathered by other researchers. So you take all of the studies that have been done and you analyze the data that's within them. These are called systematic reviews or meta-analysis, and they're often considered the highest standard of research. Another secondary data analysis is using official statistics. So researchers may analyze data collected by things like Statistics Canada or through the census. Other sources include historical documents or personal documents, public records, and so on. Some issues do exist in data collection. In observation, we often deal with something called reactivity bias. So the mere presence of an observer can often alter the situation. This is something often referred to as the Hawthorne effect. That's when people behave differently because they know that they are part of a study. So you try to observe people without being detected, and you try to allow time for subjects to habituate, meaning get used to your presence being there. After a period of time, people being studied tend to forget about the observer and they'll return to normal behavior. With surveys, one of the issues in the data collection is response bias. This occurs when respondents answer questions untruthfully or misleadingly. This can seriously damage a study's validity. Respondents could have fears about the confidentiality of the data, and they can also respond in a way that they see might be socially desirable. So, for example, respondents may lie and say that they have a car even though they don't. Other issues in data collection include generalization. That means assessing the relevance of findings beyond the sample. So, what is learned from the sample? Are you confident that that can be applied to a larger target population? And how far can you generalize from your sample? Let's take a look at an example. Let's say myself, Professor Anzavino, studied a random sample of 50 sociology students at college. Can my findings be generalized to which population? A, all students at any college. B, all students at our college, Niagara College. C, all social science students at Niagara College. Or D, all social science students in Canada. The answer would be C. So I'm taking a random sample of social science students at our college. So I can only generalize out to all social science students at our college. Other issues in data collection include ethics. They are the guidelines that are provided to researchers through professional bodies and research ethic boards. Researchers must share the results openly and truthfully. They are not allowed to falsify results, and they must not present others' work as their own. They are also bound by a promise to do no harm to participants in their studies. This includes protecting participants' identities and allowing them to withdraw from the research at any time. We will more fully explore all of the ethical considerations in human research in our next video. Step 6 is data analysis. That's when researchers analyze the data they are concerned with, including issues such as reliability and validity. So let's look at what those two concepts actually mean. Validity refers to actually measuring a concept. So here we're looking at what is the accuracy of what we're measuring. Does it measure what it claims to measure? So let's look at the example of, say for example, I wanted to study student success at Niagara College. And what I used as my measure was your grade point average. And that was the only measure that I used. Well, that might measure academic student success, but there are different measures of student success to be considered. The next issue in data analysis is reliability, and that refers to the extent to which a measure can produce consistent responses. In other words, to what degree does an instrument measure the same way each time it is used under the same condition with the same subjects? Can you get the same results? Is your research repeatable? So if we were in class together, right now I'd choose a volunteer and we'd do something called the jumping jack test. And this is a physical test just to show the concept of testing reliability. Testing reliability meaning a measure is considered reliable if a person's score on the same test given twice is similar. So say for example I asked you at home there, and I gave you 30 seconds on the clock to stand up and do jumping jacks. And let's say I predict or I hypothesize that in 30 seconds you can do 50 jumping jacks. So I say on your mark, get set, go. And you begin to do your jumping jacks. And then when 30 seconds are up, I stop the clock and we've counted that you've done 49 in 30 seconds. I give you a few minutes to rest, and then I retest. I use the same conditions, the same test, the same hypothesis, and generally, 9 times out of 10, students usually have the same or almost similar score the second retest, showing that the test is reliable. So I give the same conditions, the same test, under 30 seconds, jumping jacks, and you can get the same answer twice in a row. And the last step is the dissemination of results. So you've come up with a topic, you've done your literature review, you've formulated a hypothesis, you looked at how you're going to design your research, you've chosen data collection method, you've collected your data, you've analyzed it, and now you need to publish and share your findings. So how are you going to share your knowledge with the public? At this stage, once research is collected and the data is analyzed, social scientists must share the knowledge with the public. This can be done in a variety of ways. It can be done by publishing books or academic articles, presenting at public forums or at conferences, or if you've conducted community-based research, it's shared directly with the community that you've studied. Some of the ways to spot bad science. Well, take a look and be careful of sensationalized headlines. Watch out for conflicts of interest. Look for problems with the sample size, underrepresentative samples that are used, results that you can't repeat or you can't replicate, and maybe it's also non-peer-reviewed material. So let's summarize the key points from Unit 2. We know that there are a variety of research approaches. Quantitative research refers to numerical data. Qualitative research refers to non-numerical data. Mixed methods is both. The research cycle includes 7 steps: your idea, your literature review, your hypothesis formation, research design, data collection, data analysis, and then sharing your findings. Data collection includes methods like unobtrusive measures, secondary analysis, participant observation, surveys, and interviews. Data analysis must ensure that our findings are both valid and reliable. Every researcher must go through research ethics approval prior to starting a project with human subjects, and this is to ensure the protection of their participants. Coming up next, in our final Unit 2, Ethical Practices in Research.